Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable and relax. Flight 417, The Final Descent. Ethan Graves had never liked flying. Something about being trapped in a metal tube thousands of feet above the ground unsettled him. But this trip was unavoidable. His best friend's wedding in London demanded his presence, and there were no excuses left to give. So, begrudgingly, he boarded Flight 417 from New York to Heathrow, gripping his boarding pass with sweaty fingers. The plane was a Boeing 777, a massive beast of an aircraft. As Ethan stepped inside, he couldn't shake an eerie feeling that something was wrong. The cabin lights flickered for a split second, and an odd static crackled in his ears. He dismissed it as nerves and made his way to seat 23A by the window. The seat beside him was empty, a small blessing. Passengers filed in, and the usual pre-late commotion filled the cabin. Flight attendants performed their safety demonstration, and soon the plane taxied onto the runway. Ethan took a deep breath as the aircraft roared to life and lifted into the darkening sky. That was when the first strange thing happened. The seatbelt sign flickered erratically, blinking at random intervals. The intercom crackled and a voice, not the captain's, whispered something unintelligible before cutting off abruptly. A few passengers looked around, puzzled, but no one reacted strongly. Maybe it was a technical glitch. Ethan glanced at his watch. 10:45 p.m. They had barely been in the air for 20 minutes when the turbulence hit. The jolt was violent, unlike any turbulence Ethan had ever experienced. The plane shuddered as if something massive had struck its exterior. Gasps and murmurs filled the cabin, but before anyone could panic, the overhead lights dimmed to a sickly yellow glow. A cold gust of wind, possible at this altitude, whispered through the cabin. Ethan turned to the aisle and saw a flight attendant standing stiffly near the galley. Her face was pale, her eyes unblinking. Something about her posture was unnatural, as though she were frozen in place. The captain's voice came over the intercom, strained and distorted. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be experiencing some unexpected." Static swallowed the rest of his words, followed by a guttural noise that sounded almost like breathing. Heavy, rasping breathing. Ethan's chest tightened. He looked around and noticed something chilling. Several passengers were eerily still, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their eyes unfocused. A man in 17C murmured something under his breath repeatedly. Ethan strained to hear. "We're not supposed to be here. We're not supposed to be here." The plane shuddered again, and then the lights went out completely. Darkness swallowed everything. For several agonizing moments, there was only the sound of breathing. Too much breathing for the number of people on board. Then, dim emergency lights flickered on, casting long, unnatural shadows. Ethan's stomach dropped when he saw the reflection in his window. Something was standing on the wing. It wasn't human. Its form was elongated, limbs too long for its body. Hollow black eyes peered into the cabin. A grin, wide and grotesque, split its face, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. Its fingers, claw-like and impossibly thin, tapped slowly against the glass. Ethan recoiled, his pulse hammering. No one else seemed to see it. They were either whispering, frozen in place, or eerily still. The flight attendant who had been rigid in the galley was gone. A scream tore through the cabin as the plane pitched downward, super-ending oxygen masks deployed, swinging like pendulums. A woman clutched her child, sobbing. The lights flickered wildly, casting glimpses of shadowy figures moving in the aisles. They were passengers, but wrong. Their faces were obscured by darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. He turned to his window again. The thing was inside the plane now. It stood in the aisle, its head nearly touching the ceiling. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. It turned its empty gaze to Ethan, tilting its head slowly. The intercom crackled again, and this time a voice whispered directly into Ethan's ear, though no one was there. "Welcome home." A sharp, ice-cold pain shot through his chest, as if something had reached inside him and taken hold of his heart. His vision blurred. Darkness, creeping into the edges of his consciousness. The lights flickered wildly, casting glimpses of shadowy figures moving in the aisles. They were passengers, but wrong. Their faces were obscured by darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. He turned to his window again. The thing was inside the plane now. It stood in the aisle, its head nearly touching the ceiling. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. It turned its empty gaze to Ethan, tilting its head slowly. The intercom crackled again, and this time a voice whispered directly into Ethan's ear, though no one was there. "Welcome home." A sharp, ice-cold pain shot through his chest, as if something had reached inside him and taken hold of his heart. His vision blurred. Darkness, creeping into the edges of his consciousness. The last thing he saw was the creature looming over him, its mouth opening wider, wider, impossibly wide. Then, silence. Flight 417 never arrived in London. The official report claimed it had vanished from radar somewhere over the Atlantic. No wreckage was ever found. And yet, every few months, air traffic control receives a faint, static-laced transmission. "We're not supposed to be here. We're not supposed to be here." The turbulence had been worsening for the past half hour, but Flight 917 was still on course. Or so the passengers thought. The seatbelt signs remained illuminated as the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone eerily calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected weather conditions, but rest assured, we have everything under control." Samantha clutched the armrest, her knuckles turning white. Across the aisle, an old man murmured a prayer under his breath, his lips moving silently. A baby wailed a few rows back, its cries blending with the roar of the engines. Then, without warning, the aircraft shuddered violently, and the lights flickered. Gasps erupted throughout the cabin as the plane tilted sharply downward. Through the windows there was nothing but an impenetrable darkness, as if the sky itself had swallowed them whole. The descent seemed endless. Panic spread like wildfire. The flight attendants struggled to maintain order, their voices drowned by screams, oxygen masks deployed, swaying eerily. Then, silence. The next thing Samantha knew, she was waking up to an eerie stillness. The cabin was intact, the seats undisturbed, yet something felt profoundly wrong. A dim, unnatural glow seeped through the windows. The air was thick, humid, carrying an unsettling scent, metallic and rotten. She turned to the man beside her, nudging his shoulder. "Sir?" No response. His eyes were open, staring blankly ahead, his pupils dilated. Heart pounding, Samantha scrambled out of her seat, looking around. Others were waking too, groggy and confused. The flight attendants stood at the front, whispering frantically amongst themselves. The pilot was nowhere to be seen. A man near the emergency exit peered outside. "Where the hell are we?" he muttered. Samantha hesitated before pressing her face to the cold window. What she saw sent ice through her veins. The plane had landed in a vast expanse of mist-covered terrain. Towering trees with twisted skeletal branches loomed in the distance. The ground looked damp, pulsating as though it were alive. And then she saw them, figures emerging from the fog, their silhouettes distorted and wrong. Too many limbs, eyes that gleamed like wet stones. They were watching. The plane's intercom crackled to life again, but this time the voice was not the pilot's. "Do not leave the aircraft. They are waiting." Samantha's breath hitched. A woman across the aisle whimpered, clutching her child. A man bolted for the door, his face contorted in terror. "I'm not staying here." He yanked the handle. The moment the door cracked open, a black, sinuous appendage lashed out from the darkness, wrapping around his throat. He barely had time to scream before he was yanked into the void. The door slammed shut behind him. Silence. The passengers were frozen in horror. The intercom crackled again. "You were warned." Samantha's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Trapped in an airplane in an unknown land, surrounded by impossible horrors, there was no escape, and the creatures outside were getting closer. Story 3. The title is Flight. Ruttons after 50 years. Flight 319 vanished without a trace on June 17th, 1975. The aircraft, a commercial jetliner bound from New York to London, disappeared from radar somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. Despite exhaustive search efforts, not a single piece of wreckage was ever found. The world eventually moved on, the families of the passengers left with nothing but questions and grief. Then, on an overcast afternoon 50 years later, air traffic controllers at Heathrow Airport received a distress call from an unidentified aircraft. The signal was faint, crackling through decades of silence. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 319. Requesting emergency landing. Fuel low. Repeat, fuel low." Disbelief rippled through the control room. The aircraft's call sign matched the long-lost flight. Initial attempts to make sense of the situation were met with confusion. Was this some kind of hoax? A cruel prank? But as the controllers tracked the approaching aircraft, their radar confirmed what seemed impossible. Flight 319 was descending toward the airport, perfectly intact. The airport went into a state of emergency. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the tarmac, awaiting the landing of a ghost from the past. As the plane touched down, its landing gear screeched against the pavement. The aircraft rolled to a stop, and the silence that followed was deafening. Security forces cautiously approached the plane, weapons drawn. The jet's exterior was pristine, untouched by time. The airline's old logo still gleamed on its fuselage, and every window was intact. When the doors were finally pried open, the horror began. The passengers sat in their seats, their expressions frozen in shock. Their skin was pale and clammy, as if life had only just left their bodies. Oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling, and an eerie silence filled the cabin. Every person aboard was dead, yet they showed no signs of decay. Then, a sound, a faint whisper. "Help us!" One of the flight attendants, her uniform crisp as though she had only just put it on that morning, turned her head toward the rescuers. Her eyes were sunken, her lips quivering. "We never left," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Never left." Panic erupted as some of the passengers began to stir. Their movements were sluggish, unnatural. Some blinked in confusion, others gasped as if breathing for the first time in decades. Then the pilot's voice, hollow and broken, rasped from the cockpit. "We've been flying for so long, but we never arrived. The sky wouldn't let us go." Medical teams rushed forward, but the moment they crossed the threshold, the aircraft's lights flickered, and the doors slammed shut. On their own, the jet's engines roared to life, and before anyone could react, Flight 319 began moving. Without a pilot, without clearance, it taxied down the runway, picking up speed. The control tower's frantic orders went unanswered. Then, with a final deafening howl, the plane lifted off once more, disappearing into the clouds just as suddenly as it had returned. This time, no distress call was heard. No radar blip remained. Flight 319 had returned, only to vanish again, leaving the world with more questions than before. And somewhere, high above the earth, the passengers continued their endless journey, trapped between time and eternity. The Lost Flight. The story title is The Lost Flight, Journey into the Unknown. The roaring engines of Flight 79 echoed through the night sky, slicing through the thick blanket of darkness that loomed ahead. Tommy sat by the window, his eyes scanning the storm clouds that had begun to envelop the plane. The turbulence had started suddenly. an unnerving reminder of how fragile their journey had become. Beside him, Johnny, his best friend since childhood, sat tense, nervously tapping his fingers against the armrest. His lips were pressed into a thin line, and his eyes flicked back and forth between Tommy and the swirling sky outside. "Man, I don't like this," Johnny muttered, his voice shaky. "These clouds look way too dark." Tommy tried to mask his own growing unease with a smirk, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Relax, dude. Just some bad weather. The pilots know what they're doing. Besides, we've flown through storms like this before, right?" But as the plane lurched again, Tommy's attempt at reassurance felt hollow. The overhead lights flickered as the turbulence intensified, throwing the passengers into a collective state of apprehension. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking through the growing tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and remain calm. We'll be through this shortly." His words should have been comforting, but they only served to heighten the unease. Outside the window, the storm clouds had vanished entirely, replaced by an unholy darkness, as if the plane had flown into a void, a space where time and reason no longer held sway. A deafening boom shook the cabin, followed by a gut-turning drop that sent Tommy's stomach into his throat. His heart pounded in his chest. Johnny's face twisted in fear, but Tommy could do nothing but clutch his seat tighter as the plane seemed to fall into an abyss that stretched infinitely before them. Then, in an instant, everything stopped. The chaotic tremors ceased, the screaming engines quieted, and the plane leveled out with an unnatural calm. The silence that followed was suffocating. Tommy slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, his mind racing. He glanced at Johnny, who was still gripping the armrest, eyes wide, lips trembling. They exchanged a glance. Both of them knew something was terribly wrong. Tommy turned toward the window. The clouds had dissipated, but what lay beyond wasn't the world they knew. Instead, a vast, desolate landscape stretched beneath them, illuminated by a faint bluish glow. The ground below appeared cracked and barren, with rivers of what looked like liquid shadow winding through the terrain. The ground below appeared cracked and barren, with rivers of what looked like liquid shadow winding through the terrain. Towering, jagged formations loomed in the distance, ruins of some forgotten civilization, their structures twisted in ways that defied logic. The sky above was no longer the familiar black, or even the bruised hue of a storm. It was a pulsating, shifting mass of color. A surreal and terrifying. The colors shifted and swirled, never remaining still. There were no stars, no moon, only this impossible canvas of constantly changing hues. "Johnny," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his chest. "Where the hell are we?" The words barely left his mouth when the cockpit door swung open with a creak and a flight attendant stumbled into the cabin. Her face was pale, as if drained of all color, and her eyes were wide with terror. "The pilots?" she stammered, her voice shaky. "They're gone. They're just gone." Johnny's eyes widened. "What do you mean, gone? They can't just vanish." I checked the cockpit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no one there. The controls, they're moving on their own." Tommy felt a chill crawl down his spine. The whispers began again, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the distance, but growing louder, insistent, crawling through the cabin like some unseen force. A dozen voices whispered in strange, unintelligible tones. At first, Tommy thought it was just his imagination, but the sound grew louder, filling the entire space. "We need to land this thing," Johnny shouted, panic rising in his voice. Without a word, Tommy followed him, heart hammering in his chest. They reached the cockpit door and found it slightly ajar. As they stepped inside, a wave of suffocating air hit them. The temperature in the cockpit had dropped drastically and the lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The controls were alive, flickering and moving as if guided by invisible hands. The plane's instruments displayed strange symbols, lines and shapes that defied explanation. It was as if the plane itself was trying to communicate, but the language was beyond comprehension. Then came the whispers again. No longer soft and distant, they grew guttural, low and threatening. The sound seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cockpit, pressing in on Tommy's mind. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, shadowy mist began to seep from the vents, curling around their legs, creeping up their bodies. The entire plane seemed to be alive, filled with a presence they couldn't see but could feel in every inch of their skin. Then, the scream came, a blood-curdling shriek coming from the back of the plane. Tommy and Johnny turned just in time to see a passenger being pulled into the shadowy mist. One moment she was there, screaming in terror, and the next she was gone, swallowed by the darkness without a trace. A collective panic swept through the cabin. Some passengers screamed, others sobbed in terror, but no one moved. They were trapped. "Johnny, we have to do something!" Tommy shouted, his voice breaking. Johnny's hands were shaking as he reached for the controls, his mind racing. "I don't even know where we are, let alone how to fly this thing." He slammed his hands against the yoke, but it felt unresponsive. The whispers grew louder, merging into one unified voice. "You do not belong here." The voice hissed, an ancient, insidious tone that filled Tommy's chest with dread. Suddenly, Tommy felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around in shock, but there was no one there. The shadows in the corners of the cockpit seemed to stretch and writhe like sentient smoke. The darkness was moving, creeping closer, reaching out with clawed fingers. The plane began to nosedive. The ground below was rushing up to meet them, the jagged formations growing ever closer. "Come on, work!" Johnny shouted, desperately slamming his hands against the unresponsive controls. The cockpit was filled with a blinding white light, a flash so bright it threatened to blind them. The world around them seemed to twist, contorting into shapes and forms that defied logic. Reality itself seemed to crack, splitting apart like a shattered mirror. And then, silence. Tommy gasped for air, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes shot open, and he found himself back in his seat. The plane was steady now, the turbulence gone. He looked around, disoriented, but everything seemed normal. Too normal. The storm had cleared, the sky was calm, and the world outside looked like it always had. Johnny sat beside him, just as pale, just as shaken. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The intercom crackled to life again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the turbulence. We will be arriving at our destination shortly." Tommy looked at Johnny, his voice barely a whisper. "Did that just happen?" Johnny swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the cabin. "I don't know, but I don't think we should ever fly again." They both looked out the window, watching as the storm clouds cleared to reveal the familiar landscape below. Tommy's gaze drifted to his own reflection in the glass, but something was wrong. A shadow stood behind him, a dark, distorted figure, grinning. His breath hitched. The whispers had never stopped. Suddenly, the plane took another sharp lurch. The intercom crackled again, but this time, the voice that spoke was not the captain's. It was low, guttural, filled with malice. "We are not finished yet." Tommy and Johnny locked eyes, both realizing at once that they had never truly left. The nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. The fear that gripped Tommy and Johnny was more tangible now. They couldn't even pretend that the plane had returned to normal. The whispers were everywhere. They could hear them, not just from the intercom, but from the very walls of the plane itself. Each murmur seemed to scrape against their minds, a haunting reminder that this nightmare was real. "Johnny," Tommy whispered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Something's not right. We're not just lost. This thing is happening for a reason." Johnny nodded, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "We have to do something. We need to get off this plane." But even as he said the words, they both knew it wasn't possible. The plane wasn't just lost in some unknown region. It was a part of something much darker. And it wasn't finished yet.